Good morning, Anne. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks for having me.
President Trump said that he was attending the NATO summit in Ankara more out of respect for President Erdogan than out of enthusiasm for the alliance itself. Would you say that the United States today has one foot out of NATO, or are things not quite as they appear?
For the first time since the Second World War, really, we have a U.S. administration that does not see the role of the United States as the leader of the democratic world. It has no special interest in relations with other democracies. It doesn't value them more than that relations with other countries. It doesn't promote democracy. It doesn't put democracy at the center of America's identity. And so clearly that affects how the U.S. talks about NATO, especially how the president speaks about NATO. It's a strange moment because at the same time, the U.S. remains very integrated with European armies and with the European military. U.S. bases in Europe are there not just to defend Europe, but to project U.S. power into the world. It's hard to see how the U.S. would function without them. Mm-hmm. So the policy is contradictory, but yes, I mean, I think it's correct to say that this is an administration that doesn't think that preserving NATO or increasing the power of NATO is a priority.
Mm-hmm. The NATO Secretary General has argued that alliance members are now spending significantly more on defense, thanks to pressure from Washington. How do you assess the determination of European governments to achieve their much-discussed goal of strategic autonomy?
The most important reason why Europeans are spending more money on defense is because of the challenge from Russia. It's not just some theoretical number they need to reach because the president of the United States has invented it. It's because they see the need that they may actually need to defend themselves in the near future. And that's why the countries that have really made the greatest effort are Scandinavia, Poland, the Baltic states, Germany, the UK, and to some extent others, because those are the countries that feel really directly threatened. I think there has been really a revolution, at least in how people think about military spending. There's an understanding that it has to be different now, that some of the old platforms and projects won't work in the future. People are beginning to recognize the nature of the drone revolution and the electronic warfare revolution and the AI revolution and how that's going to affect defense. And you're beginning to see, especially Scandinavia and Germany, you're beginning to see them adjust. So I think there is actually a big change happening in military spending and procurement.
President Trump rarely misses an opportunity to express his admiration for President Erdogan. How do you interpret this close relationship, given that it appears to sit uneasily with US legislation that bars Turkey from participating in American defense programs, partly because Ankara continues to operate Russian military systems?
President Trump's relationship with Erdogan, like many of his relations with others in the world, comes from his business dealings in Turkey. So he had investments in Turkey in the past. He thinks those went well. There are his family company has some ongoing interests there or could do. And he tends to see the world in those terms. He doesn't think like a traditional American president, that I am the person who represents American interests or the interests of the Western Alliance or the interests of the democratic world. He thinks about what's good for me. And he likes Erdogan.
So simple.
It's once you have watched him long enough, it's not that hard to understand. And so what he's saying is his personal view, and he thinks that his personal view is therefore the American policy view. As I understand it, I don't know, we're speaking at a moment when we haven't heard any exact outcomes from the summit, so we don't know yet. But I understand that he could make these weapon sales to Turkey, but it's also possible that they could then be restrained by Congress. So the US system is more complicated than just what the president says.
Greece has a particular interest in the future of US-Turkey defense cooperation. On the one hand, Athens enjoys exceptionally strong relations with Washington. On the other, it remains exposed to the periodic assertiveness that Turkey displays in the Aegean. Do you believe Greece's security concerns are exaggerated in this context, or on the contrary, entirely justified?
So I'm not in a position to tell any country not to worry about its security. So Greece should make the decisions it makes according to its own assessments of Turkey. It's not really for outsiders to judge. What would make Turkey a more stable and reliable partner for all of us would be an end to the autocratic, the current autocratic regime there. It's not about Erdogan personally, but even as we're speaking this week, and even as the NATO summit is happening in Ankara, the mayor of Istanbul has endured 3 court hearings in one day. We see the democratic opposition in Turkey being shut down. All of those things make Turkey a more dangerous country. Unfortunately, as I said, the United States is not interested right now in talking about the Turkish democracy. And unfortunately, I think that probably has influence. The fact that there is no outside source of conversation about what's going on there is unfortunate. But a better, more reliable, more open Turkey would help the situation a lot.
Let us turn to Iran. Was this a war of choice? There is also the counter-argument that an Iran possessing nuclear weapons would pose a serious threat to international security.
This was clearly a war of choice. This kind of war had been proposed to previous American presidents by the Israelis. Previous American presidents made the decision not to do it for exactly the reasons that we've seen, that there would be an immediate threat to international shipping and especially to the oil and gas industries. It's clear also that President Trump regrets the decision, or in any case is not interested in continuing it. He's looking for ways to end it. He's looking for an agreement that may wind up being similar or maybe even slightly worse than the agreement that President Obama made, now many years ago. Of course, the Iranian nuclear threat, was in Israel, and it would be, but there were other paths to choose. Again, Obama chose the path of negotiation. Actually, President Trump himself supposedly bombed the Iranian nuclear facilities already last year and supposedly had done major damage to them. So the excuse that Iran was about to have a nuclear weapon doesn't really add up.
Israel, at the very least, does not appear to be satisfied with the framework agreement reached between the United States and Iran. What does this mean for US-Israel relations, and to what extent do we see Israel pursuing a more independent course from Washington in the near future?
I would hate to make predictions about the American-Israeli relationship because it's a relationship that's changing very quickly. So what you had in the past was almost universal bipartisan support for Israel, going back many decades in the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. And what you now have in the US is in both parties, have significant groups of people who are questioning the nature of the relationship and asking whether this war was necessary and whether the US support for Israel is necessary. And actually you have a similar process now going on in Israel, where people are asking about the relationship with the US and why is it that we have to go along with them. It's hard for me to imagine Israel breaking with the US or being the cause of the break because the technological integration and so on is so important. But it's a very volatile situation and one that could really go any way. Again, a lot depends on who is the next leader of Israel. Mm-hmm. And can Israel also, as in the case of Turkey, can Israel break out of the autocratic politics that have led it down a pretty disastrous road?
Do you agree with those who argue that President Trump underestimated the scale and complexity of a military operation against Iran? And is it possible that he failed to fully appreciate, in particular, the potential consequences for the Strait of Hormuz?
Obviously, President Trump failed to take into account the possibilities of the shutting of the Strait of Hormuz. He also seems to have been unaware that Iran could retaliate by striking Gulf states, and he's expressed surprise. It's a strange situation because, of course, anybody who had looked at that, looked at the situation before, and others going back, a couple of decades had also looked at the possibility of a war with Iran, and everybody had seen that both of these things were possible.
He didn't want to believe it.
Either he didn't believe it, or he didn't listen, or the people who were telling him weren't speaking loudly and clearly enough. I mean, there are different versions of what happened, and maybe eventually we'll we'll find out. But unfortunately, when you've created a political system like we now have in Washington, where people around the president are afraid to challenge him, which is again what you have in a classic autocratic system, you get bad decisions.
Unlike Iran, where you have often argued that the United States has no business being involved, you have consistently maintained that a US military presence on NATO's eastern flank is indispensable. What accounts for this difference? Put differently, where do geopolitical scholars such as John Mersheimer get it wrong?
First of all, I mean, I do think the U.S. has an interest in Iran. That's not a fair characterization of what I've written in the past. I just don't think that the way this war was begun was justified. So those are different things. Look, the war between Ukraine and Russia was started by Russia in part as a direct challenge to NATO and to the United States. So the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was intended to prove that there is no Western alliance, that Ukraine isn't a real country, and that European countries and the United States will not help Ukraine. They wanted to show that they are now the only sovereign power in Eastern Europe, and they are the ones who will make decisions about what happened. And they have been very surprised by the response, both from the Biden administration and from United Europe, which did pull together and did show that there is such a thing as the democratic world. I don't like using the word West anymore because it doesn't encompass what we're talking about. There is a community of countries that are willing to defend others who are unfairly attacked.
Do you believe the conditions are now in place for meaningful negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, or are we not there yet?
The war between Ukraine and Russia will end, and negotiations will be possible when the Russians decide not to fight anymore, when they understand that they will not achieve their main goal, which is the destruction of Ukraine as a nation. I don't think they've reached that point yet. Maybe they're getting closer. But Putin himself has never withdrawn from that idea. So far, he's used the negotiation process as a way to try to get some advantage out of his conversations with the United States. Get the Americans to put pressure on the Ukrainians to give up territory, use the negotiations as a way to draw out the war. He has not seriously looked at President Zelensky's offer of a ceasefire, and he hasn't ever said that he wants the war to end. So what we need to do is to get to the point when the Russians are willing to prepare to end the war. And that is something that I think can only come through more economic and military pressure. And I think when we get to that point, we will know it. And then, then when they stop fighting, when they cease to attack Ukraine, when they agree even to a ceasefire on the current front line, then we can have a negotiation.
Finally, I would like to ask for your political assessment of the upcoming US midterm elections. How vulnerable is President Trump heading into this contest? And how well positioned are the Democrats to capitalize on the current political environment?
A lot depends on how fair these elections are. So the White House is making an effort to push through some legislation that it would make easier for some states to push people off electoral rolls. It would make it harder for some people to vote. And so it's not just a question of who wins. It's a question of how the election is conducted, whether if the Republican Party loses in close-run states, in purple states, whether they're willing to concede. It's not only a political contest at this point, mm-hmm. It's also about the nature of the system itself. And in my view, it's too early to say how fair the election will be. When we get closer, we'll have a better idea. Both the great thing and the difficult thing about US midterms is that actually it's not one election. It's not like a European parliamentary election. Yeah. It's a very different election in each state. And the kinds of candidates who are running are very different in each state. So the election, how it looks in Texas is completely different from how it looks in New Jersey, which is totally different from how it looks in Idaho or Wisconsin or Maine. And so the success of the Democrats will depend on the particular candidates they've put forward in those states and the kind of campaigns that they run. And actually, this is, of course, the the good news about American democracy is that actually very often at many of the state level elections and many of the campaigns are better in the sense that they're about real issues and not merely culture war issues. They're about things of concern to those people in those states. And so the result will depend on how well people fight on those local issues.
Interesting. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.